Welcome back to the Wilburn Auditorium here on the campus of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy in Malibu, California. I'm Pete Peterson, the Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate Policy School, as we move now to the second session in our four-part short course on the roots of capitalism versus socialism. In our first session, we explored the arguments, the foundational discussions between John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In this session, we move further into the 18th century, 1776 to be specific, and Adam Smith, often called the father of capitalism. Once again, I'll be citing texts and quoting passages from one of two books co-written by our main speaker, Dr. Gordon Lloyd, with his partner, Nicholas Capaldi, Liberty and Equality in Political Economy, and the two narratives of political economy.
Likewise.
And with that, we welcome back Dr. Lloyd for this discussion on Adam Smith. Dr. Lloyd, great to be back with you.
Likewise.
So, Dr. Lloyd, in our first session, when we were exploring the debates between Locke and Rousseau, one of the lenses through which we looked at these discussions was in understanding the origin stories, where the point of departure was between Locke and Rousseau. Let's use that same lens again on Adam Smith. How would you describe the origin story for Smith? Where does his political philosophy begin?
Yes, and he has often been referred to as the father of capitalism. So one might say the story should begin with Smith rather than Locke. But if we're also looking at the roots of political economy, then I think we have to go prior to Adam Smith and look at Locke and Rousseau as Locke and Rousseau have specific origin stories which raise biblical questions. Smith does not have a state of nature, but he does invite us to take a look at another system, use our imaginations, and imagine something other than what we have in front of us. What we have in front of us is known as a mercantile system, which is based around merchants, but to understand it, it's like a symbiotic relationship between business and government. And business gets its licenses, and government is into monopoly, and it gets issue monopoly to the East India Company, and then puts the Queen's stamp on the Queen loves Marmite or something. So there's a mercantile system. It's not free enterprise. It's not competitive. It's very monopolistic, and markets guaranteed. And it's very overseas related, and it is part of that mercantile system. Smith objects to is its measure and understanding of what is the wealth of a nation. And it often is decided that the amount of gold you have constitutes the wealth of a nation. Or if we put it in international trade, make sure you have a balance of trade in your favor. Otherwise, then the country with whom you're competing, the country with whom you're trading is really owns you. So those concepts bother Smith. So he's asking us to imagine a different kind of world. And in that sense, he has an origin story. Imagine.
So in this series, we are tying Locke to Smith, as we will Rousseau to Marx in our next session. It's fair to say that Locke was very theoretical in his understanding and description of an economy that supports a flourishing society. Smith gets much more focused on the economics. In fact, in the title, Wealth of Nations, he is understanding that this is a more global enterprise. Tell me a little bit about how Smith understands economics now, much more focused not only on the domestic piece, but also the international or global aspect of it.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. At the same time not losing sight of the internal, but the external world has now become part of the equation or part of the question. So the origin story is imagine a world without different than what we have, and that is what he calls the natural system of liberty. So he too imagines that there is a world in which there's a different kind of relationship between politics and economics. And his understanding based on nature, without having a state of nature. So there's certain sense he's accepted the fact that we're in society. But do we have to have the society which we have? There's already been assaults from Locke onwards, assaults on primogeniture. Land is handed down to the first male born. There's been assaults on monarchy and restraining it. And then 1776 is when The Wealth of Nations was published, which is the same year of the American Revolution. So that there's changes in the air, if only in the imagination. So the origin story is an imaginative story. And then he tries to say, well, to what extent does this exist or ought to exist? So in the beginning, without getting into Adam and Eve, so now we start getting into the underdeveloped world, or the world without much industry, without much, those smokestacks, no, nothing like that. But in the beginning, imagine that what human beings are like. And he says that there is a certain nature to human beings. And what he does is to explain that nature in terms of the difference between a human being and a greyhound dog. And he says, can you imagine a couple of greyhounds and you throw a bone, you think they would sit down and discuss making a bargain over a bone? And his point is that no, that I can't imagine that. And in fact, if I now go to reality, it won't happen either. So it's not natural for dogs to trade, barter, exchange. It's mine. Human beings, on the other hand, and this is a sort of a correction of Locke without abandoning Locke. Human beings need each other. I mean, really need each other. In Locke, I help others by helping myself. But in Smith, there's much more, I think, of we're in this together without becoming Rousseau.
Right. So what I'd like to look at as well is this understanding of collaboration or cooperation in Smith. Sometimes Smith, seen as the father of capitalism, is also then seen as the father of radical individualism, as we'll explore later in this conversation. That is where some of the later thinkers on capitalism go, but that's not where Smith is. Rousseau, as we explored in our first session, obviously places a priority on cooperation, but so does Smith in his description of the capitalist system. And so I just wanted to quote here, this is page 33 in Liberty and Equality, and you're quoting here from Smith in Wealth of Nations, quote, "The woolen coat which covers the day laborer is the produce of the joint labor of a great multitude. Without the assistance and cooperation of many thousands, the very meanest person in our civilized country could not be provided for. The easy and simple manner in which he is commonly accommodated." So I'd like you to speak about this cooperative nature that Smith sees in capitalism and how we consider the support for, as Smith would say, the meanest of these.
The meanest, it doesn't mean to say terrible people. It means those who are in the worst economic condition. So that also reveals something about Smith. He has to have some standard of measurement, which shows that this system is working better than another one. So how do we measure that? The measure is the condition of the working class or the meanest person. So he would say, look, whatever you have to say about the system I'm going to explain, all its defects that you're going to come up with, let me provide this measure, that the meanest person in this civilized society, so that is the measure. So if you talk about the meanest person in an uncivilized society, I'm not interested in it, because capitalism brings civilization. Enlightenment and the arts and sciences bring civilization. There's going to be inequality. There's going to be some who have more than others. So Smith is not interested. I mean, central to Smith is not the equality of outcome question. What is important for Smith is the well-being of the meanest person in a civilized society.
Yeah, so even at this early stage, Dr. Lloyd, I think it's important for our students online here to understand that Smith's focus is not so much in describing a system that will make the wealthy wealthier, but is focused on what you might call the least of these. And in using that term, the meanest, obviously, as you say, he's describing those that could be understood at the lower rungs of the economic ladder. But he is seeking not only to focus on them, but also to measure the impact, which again is another point that we're moving further towards a more scientific economics. Smith wants to actually measure the impact of the capitalist system and to do that not only on the broader society, but specifically on the impact of his system on the poor.
So an inquiry into the nature and the causes of the wealth of nations is how do the meanest in a civilized society become better off? And how do we measure it? We don't look at them and say, look at the difference between this person who's mean and the wealthiest. That is not the standard. In other words, it's not relative. It is look at what the meanest person has and how come the meanest person in a civilized society is better off than an African king over a bunch of savages. That becomes his measure. If you're really thinking about the real problem of wealth, look there, because there the distribution question is really easy. So what is it that enables the meanest person in a civilized society to be so better off? The answer is cooperation. The answer is, like, for example, I wake up this morning, I'm going to meet you. On the back door, whatever it is a newspaper. Somebody had to print that, send it, deliver it. I put on a cup of coffee. Where did that coffee come from? I don't know, but there's a whole bunch of stages in order for that coffee to be there, in order for that paper to be there, and that's just within 5 minutes. I could probably go to Starbucks or could go down to someplace to get no, but it was delivered to my home. Mm-hmm. And I'm not the meanest in Malibu. Mm-hmm. I'm certainly not the wealthiest in Malibu, right? But it was delivered to my door, mm-hmm. and that would be the standard. That's pretty darn good.
Yes, and so let's go back to that discussion again around the origin story. And to do that, I wanted to quote this one passage. This is from the bottom of page 32 in Liberty and Equality. Quote, interestingly, he does not ask, and by he is Smith, he does not ask what is the nature and causes of the poverty of nations. Poverty is the original condition of man, but it does not have to be the permanent condition. So how do we get out of poverty? So at least we can say that Smith does understand that the original state of nature, so to speak, for mankind is impoverishment or poverty. Talk a little bit about his understanding of that and why his proposition around capitalism is intended to focus on that issue.
And so like Locke, just like Locke, in the beginning we were poor. We were abject poverty. But God couldn't possibly have meant his children in the world to be living in abject poverty. That just doesn't make any sense. Therefore, God couldn't have meant it. Another person might say, that doesn't make any sense, therefore there is no God. But Locke can't go in there, right? Mm-hmm. And neither is Smith. That in the beginning there was poverty. So I wish to inquire into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. I want to bring people out of poverty. The meanest, right? But it's not going to be by a government program. It's going to be by the nature of human beings themselves. And then there's this famous quote about the butcher and the baker. Mm-hmm. And it's a very controversial quote for subsequent scholars because two different interpretations come out of it that one can at least make a case for, and it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer that we get our meat, bread, and beer.
Right.
But rather by appealing to his self-interest. So that raises a very interesting question about what one person owes another and how we treat others, and is that selfish? And that is one of the, if you're going to criticize Smith here, one could say he is inventing or defending or creating a system of selfishness where we are only interested in our self-interest. And what's the proof? We do not appeal to the benevolence, we appeal to the self-interest as if what I can do for you. Mm-hmm. And so you get that whole society, which many critics would say is crude, and even not biblical. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what is Smith's defense? I think Smith's defense is I'm not helping create and defend a society of beggars.
What you're saying, Dr. Lloyd, then again about this issue of self-interest, could it be fair to say, as Tocqueville would later say, that there is a self-interest rightly understood, that self-interest does not ipso facto mean selfishness. It certainly could be given to that in a capitalist system, but talk a little bit about this distinction and understanding of self-interestedness in Smith's system.
Well, once you start becoming interested in the individual rather than the state, let's just use those two words, there's going to be an individual interest. So there's going to be an interest in oneself. And that's clear in Locke. The basic interest is yourself. Take care of yourself. And I think Smith builds on that. Now, one might argue that Tocqueville is self-interest rightly understood is by helping others, you help yourself. Is Smith in that model? Is Locke in that model? Or are they more in the model by helping myself, I help others? And is there really an important difference between the two? And that's a lot of scholars argue over that. I mean, many of these arguments can be boiled down to dealing with the concept of self and its the relationship to others. Do we look upon the others as enemies? Do we look upon the others as, oh, I better take care of them? Or we look upon the others as, well, I might be able to give them a job, or you take care of yourself. So this concept of self is very, very important to Locke and to Smith. For Rousseau, you've abandoned the self. So there's no tinkering. Mm-hmm. Tocqueville tinker, mm-hmm. Reverse it, and you've got, I mean, for example, you and I have talked in the past about what if you're a parent, you have a child and doesn't want to go to church on a Sunday. Mm-hmm. And what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with that? Well, I think a Tocqueville, and this is the question, is it a Smith? A Tocqueville answer would be, I don't feel like going to church. What do you feel like doing? Feel like having a pizza. Well, why don't we do both? Why don't we go to church then we go to pizza. And so it's a bargaining that's going on, even in Tocqueville. There's a trading. So self-interest, rightly understood, is linked to the capacity of human beings to respond to bargains or deals or offers. And consent is involved. And I agree to do it. And so it's a very complicated thing, but that passage that you've read from Smith, dealing with self and the appeal, and my building on the appeal to, appeal to the benevolence, has been taken as a rabid self-interest, and then here goes the story, to rugged individualism, and then there's offshoots of Smith that become rather radical, and that is Spencer and Sumner in the 19th century, and then into the Austrian school, von Mises, etc., which you can actually conceive of a world without a government at all. And that government is somehow the individual versus the state, the government, whereas Smith presumes that there is a government. So he doesn't have to go through that origin story anymore, and that there's a way to work this out if only the government would behave in a certain way, right? But once you get to the late 19th century and the development of socialism, what is going to be the answer to socialism? And then we get a much more rugged, rabid, devil take the hindmost, I'm in it only for myself. And then you have this famous formula that Sumner and Spencer follow, which is known as the ABC, and in which A is persuaded by B to give handouts to C. And that is the story of government. That's the birth of socialism. You want to know the origin of socialism? It's the ABC. So that's offered. I don't think Smith is into that.
Right. So of course, Smith wrote many things. We focused on Wealth of Nations. He also wrote the theory of moral sentiments. And before we get to the government question and the government's role in this capitalist society that Smith is drawing, isn't it fair to say that there is also an optimal cultural, there's an optimal culture that really is necessary to create conditions for a self-interestedness rightly understood?
Yeah. I'm handling, it's a very good question, and as most of your questions are very good, and not all of your questions are very good. What I meant to say is most of your questions were complicated, but if I said most of your questions were good and complicated, it would seem that some of your questions weren't. But this is complicated, and yes, there are defects of capitalism. Smith is not interested in the defects. He thinks they can be solved. What is interesting is the benefits of capitalism. By the way, he never used the word capitalism. And that's a later term, which comes with Marx and others, and when Marx calls his book Das Kapital, which means that capital, or the accumulation of money, etc., is the key to understanding the capitalistic process. It's not so much the willingness and ability of people to exchange and cooperate with each other. But that gets into Marx and others. The theory of moral sentiments and the relationship to the wealth of nations is, again, very complicated. And it has led certain German thinkers in the 19th century, when they're dealing with this, and then in the 20th century, to call it Das Adam Smith problem. How can one man be so out of tune with himself as to write a book on selfishness and a book on selflessness? It doesn't make any sense. This man is utterly gone. He should have got out from his mother's house and gone out and worked for a living, rather. It doesn't make any sense. So Adam Smith can be somehow, one way to deal with the capitalism in Adam Smith is to show that there is a fundamental dichotomy, problem, or absurdity in Smith. Therefore, we can dismiss Adam Smith because what is he talking about? Well, one way to solve that problem is to see the passage on beggars and etc. not as an issue of rugged self-interest, devil take the hindmost, but rather as a community, as a person dealing within a community. And where does the theory of moral sentiments come in? The theory of moral sentiments says one should behave in a way that an impartial spectator would judge it to be fair. So even the moral sentiments idea is built on the idea of exchange. That is, it's not just looking at one individual's behavior, but looking at the behavior of an individual in relationship to another individual. How should people behave to each other? There is a built-in infrastructure, as you're saying. One is this concept of the impartial spectator. I should not behave to another in such a way that somebody who's the impartial judge, the nonpartisan in this exchange, would say, that's a fair deal. And that should be. So why can't we relate the understanding of the fair deal to the idea of exchange? And that would be my defense of Smith. He's not a nut. Right? He's got these two books that must be related. So I think that's it, the relationship between the impartial spectator and appealing to self-interest. So the impartial spectator would say, you're taking advantage. That's not a fair deal. That's such and such. You're not playing by the rules of ethics or morality or whatever. So yeah, I think that kind of infrastructure of fair play, of not cheating, not lying, not stealing, what a nonpartisan observer would agree to and give you the nod, that's the infrastructure. Smith is not arguing about noble savages. He is buying into a lot that there is poverty in the world, and the job of the enlightened society is to come to grips with that and provide a decent life for the meanest person. And so you're not supposed to take advantage of the meanest person.
So to stay on the economic picture that Smith is painting, he also talks about the importance of division of labor. And as I think we'll see, but would love to get your feedback, understanding of it, Smith also foresees that there are going to be challenges, cultural, societal challenges to this division of labor, which can be taken even to the point, as he writes about in Wealth of Nations, where there is one person specifically tasked with putting the heads on pins. Talk a little bit about the division of labor, its importance, but also the challenges to both the individual and a society that has been really divided by even down to little micro tasks in a capitalist economy.
Yeah, that pin story is, although sort of undeveloped by our standards, is certainly an important story. One person puts the head on the pin, the other one sharpens it, etc. The well-being of a nation, we have to start with this. What constitutes the well-being of the nation? Well, we know down on the line, it's the condition of the meanest, right? That is key. But the well-being of a nation depends on its wealth. So let's make an inquiry into the nature and the causes of the wealth of nations. The wealth of nations depends upon the division of labor. If you look upon poor nations, one person has to do many tasks, jack of all trades. If you look at the education system today, at the high school level and certainly at the community college level, you must be competent in a number of areas. And if you're living in a, quote, more advanced society, then you have somebody who specializes. So that if you want treatment for kidneys, your general practitioner will refer you. And so Smith is saying is in the more rural communities, you're going to get a jack of all trades. But that's not going to develop the wealth of a nation. And that's not going to increase the well-being of the meanest person. That's going to reinforce meanness, right? So you have to have the division of labor. The division of labor is a function of the productivity of labor. So you have the wealth of the nation depends on the productivity of labor. Productivity of labor depends on the division of labor. The division of labor depends upon the extent of the orbit, the extent, that is how wide is the market. And the wider the width of the market is the key to all of this, which means that small homogeneous communities are not going to be the ideal model for Smith to increase the well-being of a nation, which depends upon the wealth of the nation. So bye-bye Rousseau. Bye-bye all those things of the small community is where, because that means belonging, people know each other, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a clear link, and we'll get to it, I think, between Madison and Smith on this whole notion of the separation of interests, the division of interests, the competing of interests. And the question is that selfishness and low? And I'll tell you what's low for Smith: poverty.
Always back to that.
Always back to that. Whereas with the socialists will say the nature and the causes of an inquiry into the nature and causes of poverty. Smith is interested in nature and causes of the production of wealth. All right, so division of labor then, pin factory, is critical for getting us out of this problem as a society. The downfall, or the drawback, is the division of labor means that we're actually like a cog in a machine. We don't have much flexibility with what we do. We show up, we do this, we have that task, we have another task, and we do it well, and we know that narrow task or job. So we're not a jack of all trades. We're a John of one trade, and we become known for it. And that we repeat it and repeat it. And if you're in a pin factory, repeating the job of putting a head on the pin is not exactly exhilarating the mind. So his point is the downside of the division of labor is what it does to the individual in manufacturing industries. And he leaves it at that. That's one page. He leaves it at that. What Marx does is to pick up that one page and make a whole theory out of it. That the downside of capitalism for Marx is precisely the downside of capitalism for Smith. But for Smith, it can be overturned. I mean, it can be solved, and that would be a role for government. Somehow, government comes in as what the system, natural system itself cannot do, because it's a fallout. It's a negative feature, but it's not so negative that you have to overthrow the system.
Right, so Dr. Lloyd, wouldn't you say that, again, to bring back in Rousseau and to jump ahead to our next session with Marx, we have this dynamic again where Smith is looking to compare what is and improving that condition, whereas Rousseau and certainly later Marx are looking to compare what is to an environment that has never been, or a set of conditions that have never been seen before. In other words, there's a dealing with what is, both in Locke and Smith, and improving those conditions. But there's a criticism of what is from Rousseau and Marx, while projecting forward a place that will be far superior to what we've ever experienced.
Well, I think that's very insightful. Because Marx has a dialectic that goes beyond capitalistic democracy. Locke and Smith, although they might have a small d dialectic in how you're moving from poverty to civilized society, they don't see anything beyond the civilized society. Now, one could say that their lens is very narrow, that we have to wait to Marx because that's 19th century, and we get this historical understanding or this dialectical understanding. And I think what is important when we get to Marx is to see that capitalist democracy is not the end of history. So there is going to be something beyond, and it's going to be better, but we don't know what it is, except that we have an image that Marx does in one passage. So Marx's main point is to criticize.
Right. That's my point. It's looking back and then comparing against some unseen future.
But the unseen future, yes. The answer is yes. But even lurking in the unseen future, the dialectic has to end. So the dialectic brings something with it. So something of feudalism is going to reappear. Because there's some good things to feudalism. Mm-hmm. That is, people like each other. The thing about capitalism for Marx is people don't like each other. They're out for themselves. So can I have a synthesis of the prosperity of capitalism and the friendliness of feudalism?
Now, we'll get to that in our next session. I don't want to go too deep.
No, I mean, yes, but it was
inspired.
It was inspired. Your question inspired me, and it just seemed that's the way. Yes, that hasn't occurred, but that doesn't mean to say that there's no image in his mind of what has happened. Mm-hmm. So Marx will give some applause to capitalism because it's moved beyond something in the dialectic. But I think this point is capitalism is not here to stay. Whereas I think Smith accepts, Smith can't imagine a world without government. I mean, he might be able to imagine in the beginning building a system of natural liberty, but these ideas of that there will be a world without government is just nonsense for Smith. Smith's a very practical fellow, including what I would think is the synthesis of the Wealth of Nations and the theory of moral sentiments on the notion of the self and others.
Now, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We're going to go more deeply into Marx in our next session. So I want to leave some of that conversation for that next seminar. But for this, I don't think we could leave a conversation around Smith without a discussion around the invisible hand. That certainly is what Smith is quite well known for in Wealth of Nations. It might surprise some to know that it only appears on one page in that 1,000-page tome, and this is the place where it does. And so I wanted to quote from that and get your thoughts on the invisible hand. This is on page 34, where you're quoting from Wealth of Nations. Every individual is continually exerting himself to find out the most advantageous employment for whatever capital he can command. He generally neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is, in this, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So again, we see this invisible hand working in a capitalist system in such a way that the broader society benefits from it. Talk a little bit about Smith's understanding of the invisible hand and how it works within a capitalist society.
Yeah, I would say that's a critique of planning. That's a critique of those who think that you can learn how to run a government or to run an economy through a bureau or whatever. I'm bringing it up to date, but that would be Smith's critique. That's a problem, not a solution. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if you think people are being selfish and not working for the public good, if you get a public good kind of economy, it's going to be worse off. Moreover, I don't know if anybody. What is the next line? I don't know if anybody that intended the public good that turned out that way.
Right. By pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it.
Yeah, but there's another line there where it says that in terms of plan, I've never known much good done by people who intend to do the public good. Never mind. All right. But so his point is, the public good is a fuzzy concept, and if you take a course or master's in the public good, and your public good choice and public good economics, you're likely to wind up with the meanest person in society, not as better off as they could be. You're much better off letting people pursue their own self-interest because there's a market system. Or, I don't quite know how it works. It works by an invisible hand. That somehow the market system produces good outcomes. So it's like if you intend good, here's a matrix for you. Intent and outcome. I intend good, and the outcome is good. Well, that's all wonderful, but right. I intend good, but the outcome is bad. Smith would say that's planning. If you're going to go along the socialist state, etc., or the mercantilist, that's it. You want good for the nation, you want well-being, but what you produce is these unintended consequences. Because, or as von Mises and Hayek would say, there's no one person who can understand how much to produce, when to produce it, what price to charge. You're going to get shortages, you're going to get queues, you're going to get everything like that. You produce, so, all right, I intend the bad with the good benefits. Now, that's very hard to explain, but I guess sometimes it happens. And then I intend bad, but I intend bad and the bad happens. That's number three. And the fourth one is I intend bad or I don't intend the public good, but the good happens. How do I explain that? It doesn't seem to make sense. It's so, right. But well, it's the invisible hand. If we leave it at the invisible hand, then Adam Smith is open, particularly as you get into the 20th century, to not only criticism but mockery. Because you get into the science and the separation of political science and economics, and science is what matters. Economics as a science matters. How the heck can you measure the invisible hand? What the heck is the invisible hand? It's unscientific. You're just copping out, trying to come up with some explanation that you have no, that it's a, well, at least it's a non-conspiracy theory, and it produces good outcomes. But you can't explain it. So Paul Samuelson,
noted economist,
wrote this book that was widely read in the 50s and 60s as the textbook. He says, well, we really don't need Adam Smith anymore because we have Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and we have all these models and et cetera, and graphs and formulas. And so Smith is really old hat. So if you want to read Smith, read it with a glass of bourbon at night or something. Just don't take it seriously.
Right.
And he said, and by the way, the only thing that will be remembered in Smith 50 years from now is the invisible hand story. And that invisible hand story is just not science. So we could dismiss Smith. Mm-hmm. Well, the invisible hand story is there. So if you're a Smith lover or attracted to Smith by various things like wealth is produced, the meanest person is better off, how do you defend? How do you well, it's a sleight of hand. And if you were to, Milton Friedman, other people, right, the idea is the invisible hand is just a metaphor. It doesn't exist. Well, doesn't he say that and he doesn't say God. Well, he doesn't say God. It comes awfully close to how do you explain it if it's not God. And in the theory of moral sentiments, he adds providence to the language. Mm-hmm. Well, how do you get out of it? Well, the way in which you get out of it is not by saying led by an invisible hand, but say as if led by an invisible hand. And if you ask a lot of economists, mm-hmm. Which I have, I said, what is the line about the invisible hand? They would say, and people are led as if by an invisible hand. Now, what you've done then is turn an actual statement in which there is an invisible hand into a metaphor, or shall we say, a scientific theory to be tested.
Right.
As if. And
That's not in the original
That's
text.
not in the original text, but that is a correction to save Smith from the critique. What he's doing is mumbo jumbo. Or you know what I mean by that. Well, the more scientific you get, I guess, the less attractive the invisible hand is. But I think the other way out is to see the invisible hand as the market. And how do you explain the markets? And somehow demand and supply. And Smith did lay that down, although he did it in about 80 pages. He didn't have nice graphs. He didn't have simple formulas. He explained that there were demand forces and supply forces. And then you get into, well, does demand create supply? Does supply create demand? And maybe it's a bit of both. But you're going to get a split in the Smith school between those who say it's demand and those who say it's supply. If you say it's supply, then you get very interested in labor. If you say it's demand, then you get very interested in the preferences of the individual. And I would say that's where the microeconomists go with a lot of their interest on individual choice, rational choice theory. But one should read Smith.
Yep.
I mean, one should read Smith, and can you put the 20th century economics textbooks to one side, which in effect mock Smith or say, well, he was good for his time, but now we know better. I mean, I have taken exams at Chicago and at McGill in which the assumption is, the assumption is that what we know today is so much more and so much better. So of course we know so much more.
Right.
There's more to know.
Yeah.
But the key there is that, and we're better at it. We know things better than we did before.
And yet,
the assumption is that Smith then was one part of a stage in the historical development of social science.
and yet we still have a housing bust. We still have upturns and downturns.
And I say, well, who predicted this 2007? Certainly not the head of the Federal Reserve Board. And we're still arguing over what is the cause of the Great Depression.
Right.
Nearly 100 years later.
So, Dr. Lloyd, in our last 10 minutes, I want to take a look at the government's role and Smith's understanding of the optimal role for government in a capitalist system. You discussed before that in education, in responding to the demands of a hyper division of labor, that education can be a pathway for those not to remain in particular jobs, that they can move on. But speak more broadly to how Smith understands the best role for government in this capitalist system.
Well, we have to distinguish between peace and war. And I think that's an extremely important one. And of course, those who are interested in the role of government and are deeply concerned that the market won't solve things, cry emergency. And when you have emergency, you have a bigger role for government, and that you want to control the markets, you perhaps more than control the markets. Mm-hmm. So I see Smith's understanding is that our optimum role for government is, if we are at war, then I have to stretch it. In fact, Smith says there ought to be subsidies for the Navy. And I would probably, and he imagines that when the wealth of the nation grows, the military will become more. How do you get a better military? Division of labor. How do you, so you're going to have division of labor within the military. So you're going to have one guy or one gal who only does bang bang, and then another one who goes, you know, such and such, and you say, there's the pin factory again, but it's in the military. Well, but there's going to be a greater role for government when there is war or an emergency. And I think Locke accepts that, Smith accepts that. although they're suspicious of emergency, they have to accept it, because if they don't accept it, no one's going to really listen to what they have to say, right? That's pie in the sky, hope for peace, clap your hands and goodbye.
And he speaks at a time when there were emergencies around the world.
Yeah, and yeah, it was the 19th century that had less war. All right, so what part does war play? Smith says, support the war effort, support such as keep the military. And as society grows and becomes more civilized, that society becomes more susceptible for being invaded and robbed. Therefore, it's a never-ending thing that the war budget is not going to go down. And so you're silly, even if you believe in private enterprise, that there's not going to be a peace dividend, right? So let's presume then, now we've handled that. The optimum role for government in, say, normal times or peace times or natural times is to do as little as possible. Because I've never known anybody intend the public good that it turned out that way. And in fact, it's better to leave people alone because they have natural instincts not to be beggars, and you don't want a nation of beggars. And so the optimal role for government is to make sure that contracts are properly made, that the impartial spectator, I mean, what is the relationship between the impartial spectator and the invisible hand? Well, apparently the invisible hand never produces something in the end which is bad. The invisible hand is a corrective. And the impartial spectator will tell you whether it's bad or not. And the answer is to be impartial. If you can, but you can't be, because you're only interested in yourself, which is why the concept of the impartial spectator is introduced. Because I've never known any good by a person intending the public good. So a person is going to be self. So it's going to be very difficult for a self-interested person to be impartial. So something has to happen. It's going to be the market. And how does that work? Well, it works, right? And sometimes it breaks down. Sometimes it goes through cycles. So the optimum role of government is to do as little as possible and avoid fraud by participants. Every decent society must be able to take care of its down and out. So this is not a devil take the hindmost. This is a decent society, but it's not a society in which everybody is taken care of by the government. You need not do anything, or inequality is going to be the major problem. So I think that would be the optimum role for government. And then where does education fit in? His point is that even the meanest person ought to be supported. We all as a society ought to support the ability and the opportunity of the meanest person in society to learn their ABCs, to be able to count, to be able to read. If you can't count, how do you do money? If you can't read, how do you know there's a public notice to stay out of air because it's not fit? So you have to be able to read. And the problem, at those days when kids were like 12, 13, they'd have to go to work to support their family. So government's education, in a sense, publicly supported education, taxpayers' money, is important to try to help those 12-year-olds not going into a pin factory right away.
Right.
So that, now, as far as universities are concerned, Smith, that's 20th century. That is a guarantee for everybody to go to college. And then that's a whole different question to get into. Smith isn't interested in creating college degrees, et cetera, et cetera. He's interested in what produces the wealth of the nation. And he understands that it produces ill-being as well as well-being. So the government then is to do something that we couldn't be able to do by ourselves, because by ourselves, we just go into send the young to work. And so that becomes, I think, part of the educational role of government, is to the ABCs of the meanest class.
And I think we'll conclude our time on that note, thanks so much, Dr. Lloyd, for this terrific conversation about Adam Smith.
Well, I think the key word here is conversation. The fact that it is great is part of the invisible hand. But thank you. No, this is great. This is great representation for the School of Public Policy. The conversation among the great thinkers and big doers. So I think your questions were very good indeed. Thank you.
Once again, we are supporters and proponents of the conversation here at Pepperdine and the School of Public Policy. We began with a discussion between Locke and Rousseau. We move now to a conversation of Smith and Marx. And again, we will conclude with our fourth session exploring all of these principles through the lens of the American Project. Thanks so much for joining us for this session, and look forward to seeing you next time.